from the first shovel in the earth to the final splash of water. In this video I'm gonna show you how I transformed a wasted corner in my backyard into a beautiful piece of nature. Let's get started. Before we can start digging, I needed to clear the area of all these tiles. This took a while, but it was very satisfying. Afterwards I marked out where I wanted to dig and decided to leave that for the first day. The next morning I got up extra early to start digging. Since there were tiles here before, the top layer of soil was just sand. And because I want the area next to the pond to be filled with grass, I had to excavate that too. With that out of the way, the real digging could begin. I came across a piece of weed blocker, which I had to cut up before continuing. I also had this drain in the way, which I had to dig up and disconnect. Up to this point the digging really wasn't that bad at all. But at this point, where the soil started to turn grey, it became much harder to dig. At this point the soil consisted mostly out of clay, making it quite hard to dig through. But after about 5 hours of digging I ended up with this. And I think this is a great opportunity to explain my vision. Right over here will be the main area of the pond, consisting out of two different sections. One being 80 centimeters deep and the other being 40 centimeters deep. Over here I'll add an intake bay which will hold the pump. Water will be sucked into here and sent up to here. This is where the filter will be. Water will be pumped in from the bottom, and as it reaches the top it will overflow and turn into a tiny waterfall, feeding fresh water back into the pond. At least that's the idea. I've never actually built a pond before, but I've watched a few YouTube videos, so I'm fairly confident that I can pull this off. Next I lined the entire hole with a layer of this geotextile fabric to help protect the liner. To save some money I went for the 1 meter wide roll instead of a giant square. Next I wanted to add a liner, but I first doubted for a good 15 minutes which side of the pond liner should be facing up. The rough side or the smooth side? I decided to just unfold the liner and go with whatever side would be facing up once unfolded. With the liner in place, it's time to start placing some rocks. I started at the bottom here and worked my way up. This is probably the hardest and most important step. I went back and forth a lot on which rock should go where, especially on the bottom layer. For this layer I only used rocks that had at least one flat side to rest on the bottom. It's extremely important to get all of the rocks as stable as possible, since I plan to stack them on top of each other all the way to the top. However, I'm not building straight up. The sides of this pond are slightly slanted and I'm using the biggest rocks at the bottom and smaller ones up top. This will create a slight slope, making them partially rest on the soil, which aids in stability. I managed to work my way up all the way to the upper layer. However, at this point it started to rain. It's been pretty dry here lately, so the rain was definitely welcome. But I was kind of nervous it would displace the soil underneath the liner. Luckily, this wasn't the case. When I came back the next day, the entire bottom layer was filled with water and I had to scoop all of it out by hand before I could continue. After I removed all of the water, I let everything dry for a couple of hours. At this point the rocks are already pretty stable, but I wanted to make sure they wouldn't go anywhere. So I filled all the void spaces with a combination of gravel and expanding foam. This took a lot of time to get right, but added a ton of extra stability. With the bulk of the rock stable in place, it's now time to get started on making the intake bay. I'll explain how this will function later in the video. I began building this portion by drilling 10 holes in the bottom of a trash can. I then cut up 10 pieces of 38mm hose and drilled a few holes in all of them, after which they were all inserted into the trash can. The whole thing could then be placed in its designated spot in the pond. I took some time to make sure it was level. Once it was, I added more small pieces of hose to help create void spaces. These were capped with a layer of bricks, river rocks and then gravel. By the way, this hole right here will connect the intake bay to the waterfall. I then continued building up the rock wall all around the pond. I continued until I was only one layer away from reaching the top. Around the intake bay this meant I could cap the coarse gravel with some finer one. With the rocks nearly reaching the top, I went around the entire thing and added just a little bit more soil all around to make sure the pond would never overflow. I also framed in the stock tub that will shortly transform into a waterfall. Next, I also cut off some excess liner to make it a bit easier to work with. To build a waterfall, I begin by drilling a hole into the side of the stock tub and adding a bulkhead with a 38mm hose adapter. I added a hose and connected it to the intake bay. I checked if it was level and started adding in river rocks. I also added in an upright piece of PVC to make maintenance easier later on. I cut out a section around the front to create an overflow. I then piled up a bunch of bricks to create a stable surface to build the rest of the waterfall on. After testing how the biggest piece would fit, I went back and locked them all in place with some more foam. Now before I go any further, I wanted to hide a trash can with this oak log. I wanted to do this first as it will help me frame in the waterfall. Next, I added the biggest rock I had available in between the log and the waterfall. However, I didn't like it there and decided to move it to the other side. This was quite a challenge since I can barely stand behind the pond, let alone safely walk over there with this giant rock. However, after a lot of finicking, I was happy with its placement and added a bit more soil behind it to stabilize it in place. With that addressed, I could continue building up the waterfall. I filled up the basin with a bit more gravel and hit the foam around the waterfall using various pieces of moss. At this point the pond is nearly done, so I went around the edge and cut away the excess liner. I made sure to leave a little bit extra, which I then tucked into the soil. I added a tiny bit more soil on top and then added a final layer of rocks which will fully rest on the soil. This really helped frame everything in beautifully. I left a tiny piece of liner exposed, and I did this on purpose. I added a piece of geotextile fabric, and this is where I want to add a few of these pitcher plants. This is a carnivorous plant that thrives in constant wet soil. It supposedly won't survive here in the Netherlands, but I've kept it outdoors for over a year in nothing more than this tray. I made sure to keep it full of water at all times, and that seemed to do the trick. Therefore, I'm pretty sure it will do fine in this pond as well. With the plants and soil in place, I folded over the geotextile and capped it with some gravel. And at this point, it's time to fill up the pond. Now let's turn on the pump to see the waterfall in action. It flows beautifully, but there's a problem. The basin of the waterfall isn't completely level anymore, and overflows near the back. This is an easy fix though. There's still plenty of liner left back there, so I'll just pull that up slightly. Now it runs without problems. That said, I still don't really like the look of this pond yet. Obviously the water still needs to clear up, but I also think I should add some plants around the edge. This made everything look way more natural, but it's still far from finished. I want to add even more terrestrial plants, some aquatic plants, and of course fish. I'll address all of that as well as make a naturalistic cover for the intake bay in a later video. But first, let me explain how the filter works. The pump will draw water into this area, which is called an intake bay. Since this area is fairly shallow, it creates a skimming effect, pulling debris from the water. Once the debris is in the intake bay, it will either remain floating or sinks into the gravel bed. The gravel will also be home for beneficial bacteria, which will process said debris. The benefit of using a system like this over a more traditional skimmer box is that fish are able to freely swim in and out of the intake bay without risk of getting stuck. The pump is also secured away after various layers of rock. This makes for very little maintenance. Anyway, after water has been pulled into the intake bay, passed through various layers of rock and into the trash can, it then gets sent up to the stock tub and through even more layers of rock. Up here I plan to add a ton of plants which will all aid in filtering the water even further. Once it's been thoroughly cleaned, it gets sent back into the pond where the cycle repeats itself. The pond itself needs a little bit more time clearing up before I want to add the fish. My original plan was to add sunfish into this pond, but since 2019 you're no longer allowed to keep sunfish anywhere in the European Union. So if you have any cool ideas, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Just keep in mind this isn't a huge pond. It holds roughly around 1200 liters, so huge fish like koi are definitely not an option. For now I'm just adding 2 of these freshwater mussels, which will help filter out algae and clear up the water. And that about sums it up for this week's video. I really hope you liked it, and if you did, I'm pretty sure you'll like this video as well. I'll see you there.